Welcome everyone, good to see you here. I'm Dee Dee Ruggles, I'm director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. And as you know, this is the Modern Critical Theory lecture series. I'd like to begin, as always, with a land acknowledgement to urge us to remember that our university stands on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations, lands that were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession, in which we have played a part, that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. So over the next 150, let us strive to be a vibrant community, inclusive of all our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. And before introducing tonight's speaker, I just want to remind you that next week we have University of Illinois Professor Ned O'Gorman, who will speak on Hannah Arendt and the question of technology. So tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from Tamara Chaplin. Tamara is an associate professor of modern European history in the Department of History, with additional appointments in French and Italian, Gender and Women's Studies, the Center for Global Studies, and the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. Her first book, Turning on the Mind, French Philosophers on Television, from University of Chicago Press, was published in 2007, and it examined the relationship between TV, high culture, and French national identity. Her work has appeared in the Journal of the History of Sexuality, French Historical Studies, and the Journal of the History of Ideas, and various other journals and edited volumes. In 2017, she published a co-edited volume called The Global 60s Conventions, Contests, and Countercultures through Routledge, and with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Camargo Foundation, and our own Center for Advanced Study, she is currently completing a manuscript on the history of lesbian life in France called, I hope this is still the title, Desiring Women.
Nope. I'll give you the title. Don't worry about
it. The title of which she will tell us, and this is the work that we're going to hear about tonight.
Yeah.
Right? Great. Mm-hmm. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Okay. I can see I have some updating of a CV to do somewhere. Good afternoon, everyone. My thanks to Dee Dee Ruggles for inviting me to give this lecture, and to the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory for hosting, and to all of you for coming today. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be here. So my charge today was to talk to you about how queer theory has informed my work as a historian. And I'm going to respond by interweaving a very brief introduction to queer theory with some queer historicizing, drawn from my new book, Becoming Lesbian, A Queer History of Modern France, which is now forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. So I'm really thrilled to be sharing my work with you. But before we explore how queering has informed my historical practice, I want to take a very brief tour into a potted history of queer theory. So we might start with the word queer, since, as Laura Doan observes, whether deployed as a verb, noun, or adjective, queer is a word that vexes and confuses more than any other concept in sexuality studies. So what does queer mean? What does queer mean? Let's not pose that rhetorically. What does queer mean?
You're going to run it like a seminar.
Just a little bit of it. Robin.
I would pose it as counter to the normative.
Counter to the normative. Okay, good. So according to the Oxford Dictionary of Word Origins, while there's some doubt as to its etymology, in the 18th century, the term was used to designate someone or some behavior or something that was perceived as odd, peculiar, eccentric, twisted, or unwell. By the late 19th century, queer likewise became negatively associated with the homosexual, who was by then an object of medical curiosity and social suspicion. To date, in the contemporary Anglo-American context, queer, in Tim Dean's words, still, quote, retains its sting, but it was nevertheless positively reclaimed in the 1980s by activist groups like Queer Nation, who utilized it to differentiate their own radical politics from those of lesbians and gays who were seeking what they viewed as traditional, i.e. conservative or heteronormative rights in the public sphere. So in modern parlance, the term is generally understood when it's used as a verb, as in my talk's title, Queering French History, as involving a radical critique of sexual and or gender identity, and even identity per se, that dismantles norms and favors dissidence, subversion, and transgression. As a noun, queer is frequently used to designate, whether individually or collectively, the members of the LGBTQIA+ rainbow. What we generally have consensus on is that queer is a term that refuses norms, particularly norms related to gender and sexuality. Put simply, queer theory is a critical approach that challenges the hegemonic privileges granted heterosexuality and gender normativity in the social world. It seeks to make visible the invisible work of the institutions, structures, practices, and people that reinforce those privileges, and to render evident the operations of power required to maintain their dominant status. Queer theory emerged in the 1990s out of a confluence of critical, cultural, and political contexts, from feminism, sexual liberation movements, including gay and lesbian rights, and movements for racial justice, to AIDS activism and post-colonialism. Teresa Dolores, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, Gail Rubin, and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick are amongst queer theory's most influential proponents. And these thinkers are successively linked to ideas such as homosexuality should no longer be seen as marginal, it's Dolores, that sexuality is discursively produced, Foucault, that sexual identities are hierarchically organized, Rubin, that gender is performative, we all know who that is, Butler, and that since people are different, and I'm quoting Sedgwick, our modern obsession with the homo-hetero binary limits human freedom and understanding. Our own UIUC library website has a very useful overview of many of these points. I encourage you to go to it and share it with your undergraduates. It's important to note that queer theory is no longer delimited to the realms of gender and sexuality. Intersectional understandings of identity formation, inspired by the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, have encouraged scholars and activists to apply queer theory to social analysis more broadly, using it to question and explore the ways in which normalizing logics often delimit human perspectives and privilege dominant groups or individuals over marginalized others. The disciplinary encounter between queer theory and history is complicated. Scholarship on the history of homosexuality was initially premised on the search for a stable sexual subject, the lesbian, the homosexual, whose supposed existence gave rise to a mode of research that Laura Doan, in some of the readings that I assigned for today, calls recovery history. Histories of homosexuality often now oscillate between projects in this vein that aim to retrieve a sort of hidden lesbian and gay past, often in order to bolster present political agendas, and queer historicist approaches, inspired by Foucault, that call that past into question by revealing the instability of identity categories. And I situate my own work in this latter queer historicist vein. So my book's title and subtitle, Becoming Lesbian, A Queer History of Modern France, collectively articulates this argument. So how so? What are the arguments that are inside of that title? Again, Not a rhetorical question. What are the arguments in my title? Yes, in the back.
Well, becoming lesbian implies that either lesbian was not a category that existed for all time, or that people had to slowly come to that identity, even if it did exist a priori before they came.
Okay, great. So we have that notion of an identity that's not stable, that is something that is achieved over time. Yeah, Jenny.
One is not born but becomes a lesbian.
Oh God, I love you, Jenny. One is not born but becomes a lesbian. In this initial title, I adopt and adapt French writer and philosopher Simone de Beauvoir's influential assertion articulated in The Second Sex in 1949 that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. She's not an audience plant, I promise. Okay. And second, the subtitle. What about the subtitle? A Queer History. What am I doing with that? Queer History of Modern France. Go for it, Robin.
In light of your really wonderful explanation of queer and how it's operationalized, I would assume that here you're saying that the queer history counters the canonical or the accepted history, or an accepted history.
Precisely. That's exactly it. Okay, I'm saying that the historicity of lesbian identity, which I argue in my title, invites us to look at the world askance, to see it afresh, to provide a queer perspective on the history of modern France. So in doing, I'm arguing that my book actually queers the French past, revealing it to be far more sexually diverse and far less heteronormatively gendered than we generally recognize. However, as my grad students in the course on queer sexualities that I'm currently teaching often remark, it is one thing to explain a theory and quite another one to apply it to a set of sources in order to produce a historical argument. So for those who are unfamiliar with my work, I'm going to take some time now to introduce the book so that we can put some meat on the bones of these rather abstract claims. In 1791, during the French Revolution, France became the first European country to decriminalize sodomy. Since that time, sex in private between consenting adults of the same gender has been permitted by French law. And yet, from the 18th century to the present, people who have engaged in same-sex activities or genderqueer behavior in France have been the targets of persecution and prejudice. And we can see that, for example, in the fact that from 1800 until 2013, although it was rarely enforced after the 1930s, women could be arrested for wearing masculine clothing, namely pants, in France, in public, unless they were granted permission by the prefecture of police. So given this longstanding intolerance of sexual and gender variance, the establishment in Paris in the 1930s of over 20 cabarets intended for women seeking women, the widespread presence of queer women on French public television in the 1950s and 60s, which is over 20 years before most people think that they actually exist on French TV. The creation in the 1970s and 80s of magazines, radio broadcasts, and early internet sites meant uniquely for lesbian audiences, and the acquisition by female same-sex couples of the right to retain custody of children in 1982, to form civil partnerships in 1999, to marry in 2013. All of these are really important examples of the ways in which sexually marginalized individuals nevertheless secured civil, economic, and political power in the French public sphere. So my chapters draw on theories of the public sphere, publics, counterpublics, and subcultures to explore this sort of paradoxical development. And France, as some of you may know, provides a particularly interesting place for this study, in part because of how individual rights are conceptualized in that country. Put simply, in the French Republican framework, civil equality and political membership are grounded in the notion of the human subject as universal, divested of all particularistic affiliations. So theoretically, what this means is that all individual distinctions, race, gender, sexuality, class, religion, and ethnicity, belong in the private sphere, which is understood as the realm of freedom of expression. But it's been robustly argued by Joan Scott and others that in practice, this abstract universal citizen is very discriminatory. The fact that women were denied the right to vote in France until 1944, despite presumably also being abstract universal citizens, can be seen as one example of this kind of disconnect between theory and practice. Moreover, since French law does not recognize minority groups as a protected class of citizens, because all of the things that unite them are relegated to the private sphere, French queers are legally disenfranchised from claiming rights on a collective basis. So consequently, what that means is that when queer people demand, whether as individuals or as groups, social recognition or political rights in France on the basis of private sexual or gender difference, they're posing challenges to the abstract universal individualism that undergirds French republicanism. And they're also challenging the way that the public-private divide is constituted and understood and lived in France. So my work investigates the means by which women who love women have nevertheless sought to make marginalized private desires and gender performances public in modern France, whether for personal or political ends. And because the modern media provides a really critical interface between private and public worlds, I focus on the ways in which the media serve as this really powerful vector for the production and the publicization of intimate life. And these primary sources on which my chapters are based really reflect this interest. So here we can see the table of contents from my book. I demonstrate how queer spaces, queer technologies, and the queer desires that shaped and were shaped by them ultimately made possible new forms of sexual citizenship, understood as both a social and a legal status, in ways that revolutionized the public sphere writ large. And so in my work, how did I do it? I juxtapose over 100 interviews that I filmed with women born between 1925 and 1969 in France and its former colonies against sources that I've gathered from private and public archives, memoirs, police files, alternative press coverage, mainstream press coverage, the Minitel, which was an early form of internet, video, film, TV and radio broadcasts, and over 700 private letters in order to situate female same-sex desire at the heart of 20th century French life. So constructed, this corpus stands as one of the largest collections of data on French women who love women ever assembled. And the almost complete absence of this material from traditional French archives has significant political stakes. And I was super excited to discover, because I was at Yale talking about my work last week, that the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library there actually wants to take part of my archive, which is amazing. So we're hoping that we're gonna actually, that we're actually gonna do that. So my book begins with the growth of an economically and racially diverse women's world in interwar Paris, a subculture of cabarets, dance halls, bars, restaurants, brothels, and boulevards, which is quite distinct from the elite white expatriate Sapphic community that has heretofore dominated the story of female homosexuality in 20th century France. I think that when we usually think about Paris Lesbos or France and lesbians, it's usually in the interwar period, and we're usually not actually talking about anybody French. We're talking about the American Gertrude Stein, the American Romaine Brooks, the American Natalie Clifford Barney, or the British Renee Vivian. So my first 3 chapters make one of my book's central claims, which is that the Sapphic subcultures that were established in Paris in the interwar years were not, as other scholars insist, destroyed by World War II. Instead, they survived the war, and they laid the groundwork for the collective construction and politicization of lesbian identity in the decades that followed. And I also insist that the very public and entrepreneurial activities of the many women who populated these cabaret subcultures and the complicated networks that governed the transfer of knowledge and support and power between them across space and time forcefully challenge, which is to say they queer, both the heteronormativity and the androcentricity of the French public sphere. And what you can probably barely see here is a genealogy of how many of these women are connected to each other. These women who owned, operated, and worked in these cabarets from 1926, when the first one that I've been able to discover was established, Le Fétiche, all the way up until 2012. And one of the things that we can see is that it really does form like a family tree. These women know each other, they hire each other, they help each other, and they work with each other. And they contradict some longstanding arguments about queer social geographies, which claim that women, particularly lesbians, don't actually exert power in the public sphere because they're economically underprivileged, because they're too romantic, and they just, once they meet up with their little partners, they just retreat into the private sphere, and that they're not actually either capable of or interested in interacting in public. So what follows in the remainder of this talk should be considered as a kind of prolegomenon, or an introduction to some of the ways in which I approach the writing of this queer critical history. And first I'm going to focus on some of the epistemological and ontological challenges that conceptualizing this kind of scholarship presents. These are things that we've talked about in my queer history class. And then I'll turn to one or two brief examples that I believe demonstrate why the queer work that queer critical history does matters, both for the history of France and for history more broadly. So let's start with some of the challenges. First, all of my claims are premised on my capacity to analyze the historical subjects whom I've identified. Okay, so my subjects are women who love women. So that said, if on the one hand, my work builds from a belief that attraction between women has always been a force loose in the world, circulating unpredictably among us, just as attraction between women and men is supposed to do. On the other hand, a queer critical approach insists that this belief does not mean that we can identify or know lesbians in the past, or that we should think of them as necessarily sharing our contemporary sensibilities about female same-sex desire. Further, if my book aims to expose how identity categories as seemingly self-evident as lesbian or even women are culturally constructed, historically contingent, and deeply entangled in the disciplinary politics shaping the distribution of power in modern societies, how do I identify them, and how do I name them, and how do I write about them? And how many of you have read Joan Scott's The Evidence of Experience? Anybody read that article in here? Evidence of Experience? If not, I recommend it, but it's a mind twister. Joan Scott argues that experience has no necessary purchase on truth, that it is also discursively constructed, and that it actually produces the subjects that it interpolates. If all of this is true, then how do we name the queer past? How do we actually write about it, let alone analyze the historical subjects that we seek to describe without performing precisely the kind of ontologically stabilizing moves on them that we are purportedly attempting to avoid? So we're going to take an example. My book opens up with an anecdote, and I introduce a person named Fred, who directed one of the most famous cabarets in Paris called the Carol's Club from 1948 to 1967. Fred was born female and christened Suzanne, but she took the name Fred when she was first employed at a Sapphic cabaret, which is a cabaret for women seeking women, called the Monocle, in 1934. And these are some very famous photos by Versailles that perhaps some of you have seen, easily available on the net. An elegant masculine individual who never appeared in feminine dress and who counted the celebrated actress Marlene Dietrich as her lover, Fred was hailed as, quote, the most famous lesbian in the world in both the French and the American press. Indeed, by the late 1940s, Fred was so famous that a 24-year-old Jewish gay girl from the Bronx named Mickey Leff read about her in the newspaper and flew to France to try and meet her. So when Mickey got to Paris and discovered that Fred had already left for the south of France, where she ran another cabaret during the summer, she followed. And the women met, and Fred was entranced by Mickey. But she was also already involved with another woman. Here we have the young Fred when she was transitioning from Suzanne, and here we have Fred and Mickey. But when they meet, Fred is involved with the 19-year-old Russian Jewish socialite known as Princess Zina Rashusky. And I just love this. Is an office wife snatching your husband? But that's Zina. She's not interested in your husband. She's interested in your wife. The American Mickey had evidently made such an impression, however, despite the fact that the two women could barely speak to each other because Mickey didn't speak French and Fred hardly spoke English, that 4 years later, a newly single Fred sends Mickey a letter. And in that letter, there is an all-expenses-paid invitation to move to Paris and a contract to work as a hostess and interpreter at the Carol's Club. Mickey accepted. 3 months later, she reports, having graduated to mistress of ceremonies and stage diplomat, I was in love with Paris, the Carols, and Fred. And the two women moved in and married shortly thereafter. And this is a photograph that was taken on the day of their engagement in 1954. You can see the ring on Mickey's hand. I got all of this stuff from her nephew, who inherited the materials from her and who lives in Princeton, and sent me boxes and boxes of photographs and stuff, which was really awesome. So now let's think about the story that I've just told you. In it, the language that I've chosen to tell you this story has already inscribed a whole set of arguments and assumptions on our historical actors. For one thing, I've not only shared with you the fact that Fred was born female, I've also chosen to identify her with the pronouns she and her. But is this choice entirely accurate? We do need to admit, after all, that Fred gave herself a gender-neutral name. On the other hand, in her handwritten memoirs, Mickey calls Fred, and I quote, a lady once described as the most famous lesbian in the world. So should my history of this couple also identify Fred, a person who always appeared cross-dressed in public, a person known for her masculine elegance, who married her girlfriend in 1954 as a lady? Or is she better designated as a butch lesbian, or a transgender, or a female husband? And what does it mean that Fred's wife, Mickey, called herself a gay girl, but rejected the term lesbian? Can I call Mickey a lesbian if Mickey didn't call herself lesbian? How can I write about the sexual past while keeping the historicity and hence the instability and the unknowability of sexual subjectivity in play? These are really thorny conundrums. For clearly, in discussing these individuals and the history they were a part of, we are, and I am, necessarily constrained by language. So let me share with you some of the choices that I've made to contend with these issues and walk you through some of my logic on it. How do I name the queer past? First, I pay careful attention to the historicity of language and to the etymologies of desire. This means basically that in my book's introduction, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how people in the past talked about and described women who desired other women or had sex with them. So I discovered, for example, that there are numerous terms designating sapphic subjectivity, which revolve around the French word for garlic clove, goose, which was an homage to the physical form of female genitalia. In this case, the goose was presumed to be masculine and active, and the vril, for the tendril or the vine, was feminine and passive. One might eat garlic, be a garlic seller, or should one decide, like Fred and Mickey, to set up a house together, One could get married at the garlic market and become accouplé, a female couple. I likewise explain in the introduction how the word homosexuel was widely adopted over lesbienne by women in the mid-20th century, until lesbienne took on a newly politicized life in the 1970s. So I look at all of these things and I remind my readers that as a vocabulary that pathologizes those whom it labels, all of these terms and others like them are also often assigned, even when they're not assumed. So while I concede that to name the world is also to transform it, for pragmatic reasons, I begin this process with recourse to historical precedent. Ultimately, in my work, I employ in English translation, which is, of course, a whole other issue when you're working on sources in a different language, terminology that was common at the time in my sources, mainly Sapphist, homosexual, lesbian, and queer, to refer to women who desire other women. But I also explain to my readers that I'm cognizant that many of the women that my sources discuss may not have thought of themselves in these terms. And to that end, I argue that I use these labels as a form of what we've talked about in our class as a form of strategic essentialism, okay? That permits us to speak coherently about the sexual past, while at the same time bringing my readers' attention to the distortions that may ensue. So second, whenever the evidence permits, I try to convey how individuals understood their own erotic inclinations and gender performances. But I also try to alert my readers to the forces that could be shaping those enunciations. So my historical subjects sometimes use certain words or expressions to talk about themselves. Women would say they were comme ça, they were like that. Or a very common term even today is goudou, which comes from the epithet gouine, which was a negative term for lesbians, and goudou plays on the French words for sweet and taste. It's sweet taste. So it's a kind of a riff on gouine, but a positive reappropriation of that. A lot of that kind of evidence usually comes from memoirs or letters or interviews, and it's super fascinating, but we have to ask why our subjects describe themselves as they do, to which audiences, under what circumstances, and at what times, right? Rather than to presume that any form of self-revelation is necessarily providing us with the evidence of experience. Because we all know that we talk about ourselves in different ways to different audiences, right? Thirdly, I define my terms, which is what I'm doing here. This means I spend a lot of time explaining to my readers how I justify my choice of labels. So I talk about the fact, for example, that I use the word lesbian, even though it really has only had its modern sort of political valence since the 1970s, because it was actually in use since the 19th century. In 1978, the French writer, philosopher, and radical lesbian Monique Wittig famously argued that lesbians are not women in her article, The Straight Mind. In this piece, she identifies heterosexuality as a political regime. She calls the categories of man and woman into question, and she identifies lesbianism as both an act of resistance and the only viable response against patriarchal oppression and the appropriation of women. She's basically saying that people who do not submit to patriarchal domination are not women, because that's what constitutes being a woman in our society. Her assertion fractured the lesbian movement, but it also reminds us that even the terms female and woman are political constructs, not ontological givens. But in my book, I do choose to use the words female and woman to name people, identified as such according to conventional understandings of sex and gender as binary categories, female, male, masculine, feminine. And I emphasize that one of the reasons that I do that is because these very categories were being deployed in the 19th century by sexological arguments for gender inversion. So gender inversion is helping to produce these notions of the gender binary at that time. Do we all know what gender inversion refers to? This is an explanation for homosexuality in the 19th century, which is that basically the only reason that I could possibly desire Didi is because I have a man trapped inside of my body, and therefore I'm a gender invert. Okay. So my historical subjects lived inside of that world of knowledge, and so I placed them there. And my pronoun use follows from that historical practice. And in this, I differ from certain scholars like Rachel Mesh or Jen Mannion, who both opt for they, them pronouns when they're speaking about individuals that we might call sometimes trans before trans, or female husbands, things like that. At the same time, I'm really aware of the fact that sexual misfits and gender outlaws might have identified today as trans, or simply as individuals who rejected patriarchal ideologies in the heterosexual system. So some of these people actually might not have seen themselves as women at all. But I call them women, and I tell my audience that I'm doing that. I also call same-sex couples composed of one masculine and one feminine woman butch femme, even though that English expression was a later descriptor for the kinds of performative practices that I describe. So in sum, what I do is I create a lesbian lexicon. I describe its history, I explain its uses, and then I justify the ways in which I choose to use it, while always emphasizing this inescapable distance between the signifier and the signified. So finally, fourth, and perhaps most importantly, I frame my questions within the parameters of queer critical argument. And this last point is really crucial and difficult. So I'm going to spend the remainder of the talk today illustrating what I mean about that by talking about another woman, the lesbian cabaret artist Susie Solidor, and her impact on a tiny town on the French Riviera called the Haute de Cagnes. So what we're going to be thinking about is, what is a question that applies inside of a queer critical argument? And how might those questions be different from questions that we would ask if we were just doing what Doan calls recovery history, looking for lesbians in the past? So Susie Solidor is a totally fascinating person for queer inquiry. She's variously labeled as a lesbian, as bisexual, and as heterosexual in the press. She performed both full-blown femininity, we can see her doing it there, and a kind of ostentatious, rowdy masculinity over the course of her life. So her story kind of incarnates queer subjectivity. In what follows, I focus first on her biography and second on her social impact. And my points are really simple. The biographical focus reminds us why the questions we ask when taking a queer critical approach to history and identity matter. And the second focus, which is on the social impact, demonstrates how the history of lesbian life in modern France helps us to queer the history of modern France more broadly. So during the early 1930s, and all the way through until the 1960s, Susie Solidor, who was known as the French Dietrich for her wartime rendition of the celebrated song Lily Marleen, was amongst the most famous cabaret artists in France. Even the fact that she was convicted of Nazi collaboration in the Purge trials after World War II failed to eclipse her reputation or allure. She was the illegitimate daughter of a domestic servant and her wealthy employer, and she was born in Brittany in 1900. She was a truant and a rebel. She was one of the first women to get a driver's license in France, and she began driving an ambulance at the age of 15 during the First World War, chauffeuring generals around the front, and apparently also injured soldiers. At the war's end, she'd had too much fun doing that. She didn't want to go back to Brittany, so she headed up to Paris. And she was quickly seduced by a wealthy antiques dealer named Yvonne de Bremond-Dars. Here we have a fabulous photo of them. Their scandalous 11-year sapphic liaison transformed the young Susie into a worldly Parisian sophisticate, a known lesbian, and a regular fixture of the summer season in Deauville. And there she is wearing a very famous bathing suit made out of seashells, which is now in a museum. It was also Bremond-Dars, her lover, who commissioned the first paintings of Solidor from a series of celebrated artists, including Tamara de Lempicka and Kees van Dongen and Picasso and Cocteau, and I could go on, because Solidor's collection, which is now on permanent display at the Chateau Musée Grimaldi in the south of France, grew to include over 225 portraits, making her, by some accounts, the world's most painted woman. By 1933, even though her lover had done all of these things for her, her lover was kind of suffocating. So she severed ties with Bremondars, purportedly by sleeping with a man who was the heir to the Packard automobile empire, and she reincarnated herself as a singer. And her first cabaret, La Vie Parisienne, was the platform that propelled her to fame. Within months of its opening, the alluring Solidor, with her cropped flaxen hair, her bombshell figure, her husky voice, her dramatic diction, and her repertoire of torch songs and salty sea shanties and erotic ballads, had cemented her reputation as an icon of modernity and sexual liberation. Her success was so immediate that in 1935, she was actually chosen as the first singer to be broadcast on French television when that technology was still in its infancy. Jean de Limeur cast her as a lesbian cabaret singer in his cinematic remake of Victor Marguerite's blockbuster 1922 novella La Garçonne, which we could translate as The Tomboy. And for those of you who don't know, this book was a wild morality tale where there's a charming protagonist named Monique who discovers that her male fiancé has been cheating on her, and so she chops off her hair and she sheds her corsets and she shortens her skirts and she goes out and she has an affair with a woman. And as a spoiler alert, Monique returns to the guy in the end. More fool she. Solidor plays the lesbian to Monique in the second version of this film. There's a third version, actually, in 1956, in which Solidor's protege, Colette Mars, actually plays the lesbian. So this cinematic appearance contributes to her renown, and her calculated revelations about her sapphic desires make her a focus of constant media attention. She even records an album, Paris Lesbienne, okay, in homage to her female fans. And she sings songs like Obsession, where she declares, Chaque femme je le veux, des talons jusqu'aux cheveux, meaning I want every woman from her head to her heels, and especially a song called Ouvre, which there's a verse that translates, open your arms to embrace me, open your breasts so that I can lay upon them, open to the fury of my kiss, your pink lip. And this, we should be able to hear a little bit of that song.
Ouvre la fenêtre à tes seins, ouvre ton corsage de soie, ouvre ta robe sur le terrain, ouvre convoi.
Open your dress, open it so that I can see you.
Ouvre mon cœur, ton cœur trop plein, j'irai le boire à ta bouche, ouvre ta chemise de lin.
Open your linen shirt so that I can touch you. We get the idea here. So in 1936, Solidor granted an interview to the tabloid magazine Confessions. Published as Susie Solidor reveals her strange destiny of a woman without men, it's the only print source where the singer speaks at length in the first person. And in it, she depicts her first lover, Yvonne de Bremondars, as the real lesbian in the couple. So Bremondars, she says, is dark, small, solidly planted on her flat shoes, an eternal cigarette between her fingers, with hair shaved shorter than any man, sporting a masculine-cut navy blue suit that revealed an almost complete absence of breasts. It would be unjust, Solidor states, to condemn women of Bremondars' species for loving women or dressing in masculine clothes, for she concludes, quote, one might as well demand that a fish become a bird. So although she concedes that in truth, and I quote, I took too much pleasure in our life together to call it scandalous or to accuse Mademoiselle, her lover, of perversion, in differentiating herself from her lover, she nonetheless insists that she was not, to quote Lady Gaga, born this way, right? So at the same time, Solidor is clearly making no secret of her desire for women. but she just as adroitly is manipulating the topic of her relationships with men. One way that she does this is via the possibly fabricated story of her torrid love affair with the married aviator Jean Mermoz. He's a right-wing aviator. Now, Mermoz tragically dies when his plane crashes, some people might say conveniently for Solidor, into the sea on December 7th of 1936, just a few days after this article was published, when he's en route from Senegal to Brazil. And in a biography of the singer, Marie-Hélène Carbonel plays up the significance of this passionate love affair with men, emphasizing that Susie Solidor was not a lesbian militant, just a woman without taboos who was prodigiously free. And Carbonel maintains that the aviator, Mermoz, was the great love of Solidor's life. And Solidor certainly seemed to want the world to believe this, because in her cabaret, she would read passionate love letters that supposedly she had gotten from him aloud before her appreciative audiences, and she would flaunt this fabulous brooch that supposedly he had given her, which was a heart-shaped diamond shot through with blood-red rubies that were dripping from it. And so this display of really normative heterosexuality is really strikingly performative, but it's impossible to verify. And it's not just the gender of her object choice that's difficult to determine, because her own gender performances change considerably over the course of time. So she plays the femme fatale in her youth, and here we see her again in La Garçonne. Interestingly, her cabaret, La Vie Parisienne, eventually is taken over by Fred in the 1970s. So we have this sapphic genealogical geography that takes us all the way through. Here, in a newspaper article published when she died, we can see that she's moving fluidly between feminine and masculine gender performances throughout her lifetime. We have these sexy publicity shots from the interwar period where she's entirely nude except for wearing lipstick, or she's clad only in fashionable evening gowns. And then by the time that she moves down to the 1960s, we see her in the 1960s to the south of France. We see her here. She started wearing an admiral's costume and a hat. And she made people call her the admiral. And she adopted masculine pronouns. And she developed a penchant for sporting manly cloaks that she wore à l'Aristide Bruant, who was this iconic 19th century French cabaret singer, an impresario. So how are we supposed to interpret who this person was, right? Solidor never lived with a man. After her 11-year liaison with Bremondars, she had two enduring relationships. One was with a Jew who worked as a double for the black performer Josephine Baker, and who bore a striking resemblance to her, named Doris. And then she had a long relationship with a woman named Daisy, the Baroness de Vaufremont, who was purportedly a real beauty, 11 years younger than her. And when Susie died, she left her estate to Daisy. But her lover was obliged to pay rights of succession because the women weren't family. They're now buried side by side in a cemetery near the beach, near the last place that she lived in Cannes-sur-Mer. So throughout her life, she's presenting herself, or being presented alternately, as an unrepentant lesbian, as a bisexual modern woman, as a heterosexual romantic who preferred men but was divided from them thanks to her deviant upbringing. She has a masculine allure in her teens when she wears military dress on the battlefield of World War I, but she aggressively flaunts her femininity in the cabarets, and then she again adopts masculine dress and male pronouns at the end of her life. And public perceptions of her were utterly confused. In 1945, the police files identify her as une lesbienne notoire, a notorious lesbian. But in 1947, just 2 years later, they argue that she's not actually a lesbian. She only uses that as a publicity ploy. And you could certainly argue that that would be the case as far as her relationship to the aviator, Mermoz. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that this fractious question of Susie's true sexual subjectivity is not the point. It's immaterial. In essence, if we're trying to figure out what she really was, then we're asking the wrong questions. And we're also asking questions that we can't answer. So what matters in a queer critical approach is what Solidor's life and the packaging of her desires for public consumption by herself and by other people can tell us about what is at stake in assigning sexual categories at particular historical moments, in this case, in France, in the 20th century. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick writes, the importance of the category homosexual comes not necessarily from its regulatory relation to a nascent or already constituted minority of homosexual people or desires, but from its potential for giving whoever wields control over the category homosexual, a structuring, definitional leverage over the whole range of male bonds that shape the social constitution, unquote. Solidor's story and the way in which she exerts power over the whole range of male bonds that shape the social constitution by skillfully negotiating categories of female same-sex desire and gender performance helped to queer the French public sphere by rendering visible the work of the institutions, the structures, the practices, and the people that reinforce heteronormative privilege. But examining Solidor's legacy doesn't just illuminate how that privilege functions. Her life also helped to break that privilege down. So now I'll conclude. In March of 2016, I visited the Haute-de-Cagnes on the French Riviera, a medieval village of about 650 people, to which Susie Solidor retired when she relocated from Paris to the south of France in 1960. And shortly after she arrived, Solidor opened a cabaret in the vaulted cellar besides her new house on the town's main square. The Haute-de-Cagnes is perched above the city of Cagnes-sur-Mer in a commune of the same name. It has been governed by the center-right since 1962. Almost 1/3 of its population voted for Marine Le Pen in the first round of the 2017 presidential elections. If you don't know who Marine Le Pen is, she is the leader of the far-right National Rally, which has been doing increasingly well. It's a fascist party that's been doing increasingly well in the presidential elections. She's been running for president for decades now. And Cagnes-sur-Mer is a strong bastion, right-wing bastion. This is where Susie Solidor moves. So in the immediate post-war years, the townspeople are known for their conservatism and their homophobia. When I arrived in the Haute-de-Cagnes, it was raining and already dark. I wasn't tired. I wasn't cowed by the weather. So I decided I was going to stroll around before turning in. And I walked around and I came across these two old men who were on a porch underneath a light, a neon sign that read Cercle des Amis, Circle of Friends. And they looked like locals. So I walked up to them and I introduced myself as a historian from America. And I asked them if they'd ever heard of a woman named Susie Solidor. And to my surprise, their faces lit up and they summoned me inside. The place appeared to be some sort of neighborhood club. It was noisy, it was crowded, it was filled with old men drinking cheap wine out of really short, stout glasses around long tables. And my hosts introduced me to the crowd. And 33 years after her death, Susie Solidor emerged like an apparition in their midst. Over the next 4 days, I met her former gardener, her cook, and the artist living in what had been her home. I read letters that she had written on thin blue stationery, and I looked at photographs of the singer posing with neighbors. And I met a man named Jean-Marc Nicolai, who had grown up in his great-grandmother's house next door to Solidor's on the Place du Château. And he now serves as a guide for the Haute-de-Cagnes Department of Tourism. And Jean-Marc described his great-grandmother's outrage at the, quote, bad lesbian behavior that Susie Solidor had attracted to the town. As a small boy, he used to play on the Place du Château, and his great-grandmother would watch from a nearby bench. And he remembers very well, and he describes this to me in the filming interview that I was doing with him, how one day she springs up on her feet and she calls out in a panic, Jean-Marc, Jean-Marc, come quick, come back to the house quickly, quickly, I don't want you to see that, come inside. And what is the cause of her distress? Two women passionately embracing on the threshold of Solidor's home. And the sight was not unique. Many townspeople spoke to me of how the lesbians who descended on the town shortly after Solidor arrived shocked locals by flaunting their private desires in public. Others were intrigued. Gregarious, extravagant, and opinionated, Solidor revivified the Haute-de-Cannes' declining economy. She brought glamour and excitement to the townspeople's lives. She employed locals, but she also included them. Every year on her birthday, she threw an enormous costume party that became a celebrated annual event. She became a member of the community. Despite local resistance and her basic disregard for feminist activism, both her cabaret and her very existence incarnated a form of lesbian politics. Her impact on the Haute-de-Cannes makes this clear. In transforming, in queering the public sphere, she transformed public opinion. Indeed, Jean-Marc Nicolai confided in me that he believes that his willingness to accept that people have the right to love who they want, regardless of gender, is a direct result of his childhood exposure to lesbian visibility in the community where he lived. So in utilizing the lives of women who love women to explore the ways in which being seen, in its most profound sense, is central to human dignity, my attempt to queer French history makes three claims. First, I argue that lesbian history matters, not simply for what it tells us about other things, but because the experiences of women who desire women, women like Fred and Mickey and Susie Solidor and Yvonne de Bremondars, matter. Second, becoming lesbian insists that due to the double domination that lesbians of all colors experience as both women and as sexual minorities, lesbian history cannot be subsumed within either histories of feminism or histories of homosexuality or queer histories more broadly. And finally, third, by revealing lesbian identity as a process of becoming, my work demonstrates that sexual desire is a living construct that waxes and wanes across time and place, even over the lifetime of a single individual. Susie Solidor, a woman who alternately presented herself as hyper-feminine, masculine, lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual, is a perfect example. Given these convictions, becoming lesbian is thus a plea for seeing and celebrating how the world that we live in already is, always has been, and always will be far queerer, i.e. far less normal, and far more diverse than we generally recognize. Rendering that queerness more public renders our world both more real and potentially more equitable. Thank you.